Good evening and welcome to our midweek Lenten devotion at Memorial Lutheran Church in St. Augustine, Florida. Unfortunately, we're not at Memorial Lutheran Church this evening as we have been for the past 3 weeks, and that's because of the quarantine. So as I begin, I'd like to thank you for listening in. For week 4 of our Lenten midweek devotions, we continue with the book The Silent Land by Martin Laird. So far we've talked about and practiced how to be silent, how to use regulated breath for contemplation, and how to use a prayer word of our own choosing, of your own choosing, to silence what we call the chatter of our own minds. This talk is taken from Laird's 6th chapter called From Victim to Witness, Practicing with Affliction. One of his quotes at the beginning of his chapter comes from Mark Twain, who said, "I'm an old man now, and have had a great many problems. Most of them never happened." I think I understand what he's saying here. The chatter in my mind and in the minds of most of us has a theme, and the theme is imagined fear. When I was in college, I saw a TV broadcast for the very first time of the film Psycho. It was about 10 years old in those days, and it still had the power to shock as well as frighten. At that time, the film was about a decade old and still had tremendous power to frighten. As my friends and I sat in someone's pleasant Midwestern living room, we watched the story of Marion Crane's destruction unfold. At one point, after she steals the money from her boss, escapes across the lonely desert, and prepares to avoid capture by exchanging cars, the director Hitchcock has her sit in her car alone with the money. She hears in her mind her boss talking about her theft, the others in her life commenting on what she's done and criticizing her, and even the policeman that she imagines following her is noticing and talking about her guilt. It turns out that none of them are doing this. It's all in her mind. The internal story of her life that she has put together drives her to the Bates Motel and her murder. Her internal story about her life, though it isn't even true, ends up destroying her. In The Silent Land, the author relays a more elaborate true story with certain details changed for privacy's sake. He writes about a nun who loves her contemplative community until one day she has a run-in with another nun. Her fears about interacting with this other nun grow over time until they occupy all of her thinking. Then she becomes afraid of everything, listening carefully to the inner story that she's constructed about her, how her monastery might force her out or close, leaving her defenseless. When she hides under her bed and has to be induced to come out, it's decided that a change must be made, and part of that change is learning how to confront her fears in contemplative prayer. So the nun begins to understand that in the use of silence, breathing, and prayer word, she might exist alongside her fear. Not eliminate her fear, but exist alongside it. And it worked. Until her parents died and she had to transfer to another monastery, then things began to fall apart again, all at once. The nun understood at this point, though, during her contemplative silence, that her fears were simply an assembly of certain facts about life and an uncomfortable feeling in her body when she thought about them. She kept this quote from a Greek saint near her bed in her workplace. It reads, "Attentiveness is the heart's stillness, unbroken by any thought. In this stillness, the heart breathes and invokes endlessly and without ceasing only Jesus Christ, who is the Son of God and himself God." Please let me repeat that for you. Attentiveness is the heart's stillness, unbroken by any thought. In this stillness, the heart breathes and invokes endlessly and without ceasing only Jesus Christ, who is the Son of God and is himself God. Another breakthrough for this spiritually growing nun came at the point at which she realized in her silence with God that she was relying on her own powers of concentration instead of God. That was another obstacle that she found she could overcome. Silence, breath, prayer word. part of the chapter that seemed to make sense to me was a quote from someone named Simone Weil, who said that fear in life was a wall. A wall separates two people, but the same wall is a connection between the two. Fear in prayer is recognized is what it truly is, not the chattering about our inadequacies or the imagined threats around us, but a wall that both the praying person and God touch to remind of their connection. Now that's pretty deep for someone like me who would just like to find a way to pray with some focus and concentration. So the book gives other examples, and as you read them, they resonate more and more deeply about our condition. Hobbled by fear of one thing or another. Death, in one case, addiction in another, or something else. I found a part of myself in each portrait that the author gives, and I wondered more and more if there was a way to stop the chatter that magnifies fear and to truly experience God. In the book of Acts, St. Paul speaks to the citizens of Athens about his faith in Jesus. They don't seem to have much idea what he's talking about, but then he offers them this. Listen to how Paul alerts them to how they can experience God in contemplation of his presence with the silence. He writes, "The God who made the world and everything in it, he who is Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in shrines made by human hands, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mortals life and breath and all things. From one ancestor he made all nations," and Paul continues, "so that they would search for God and perhaps grope for him and find him, though indeed he is not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being." Paul draws them away from the noise of a city filled with gods that they don't know how to experience and couldn't experience at any rate, and the fears that surround that kind of worship. He draws them away from that to a God who knows them in the silence and who wishes to know them there. It sounds like what Paul was offering them was the beginning of a way to move through the groping for peace that would allow us to silence our endless internal chatter and to sit beside the God that is, indeed, not far from us, but in whom we live and move and have our being, beginning with the silence of contemplative prayer. In our other worship services, we move through silence and prayer timed in seconds, then minutes, to begin this discipline. This time, I urge you to set your goal for prayer of either 3, 5, or 10 minutes of silence, using breathing and your prayer word. Use the timer on your phone for convenience, or there's an app for your phone called Centering Prayer. Blessings as you spend this time with God.